Lloyd Russell Moyle, Labour MP, thanks for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. What do you understand by the term the Kurdish question?
My understanding of the Kurdish question is a simple answer. It is how the Kurds decide the future of their own lives and their own lands. How we do that is complicated, and it might well be democratic confederalism, it might well be an independent country, it might well be another solution. And how we got here is complicated as well. It is based about imperial forces dividing up lands and not taking local situations and local peoples on board. But going forward, there are many good examples and ideas of how we need to ensure that the Kurds have self-determination, a principle defined in the UN Charter, a principle agreed in international law. Now we need to apply that principle for the Kurds that live in Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And finding a solution for all of those areas will not just be one solution, there will be many and multiple depending on the country and the situation. And that's why democratic confederalism is probably at the moment the most flexible.
How important is the role of the PKK in the current situation in the Middle East? How has it evolved over the years?
Well, my view is, without drawing false analogies, the PKK is a bit like the IRA in many respects. And that relationship with the IRA and then Sinn Féin, which in Turkey I would say is probably a bit more like the discussions that you have about HDP. And I think it's important that we understand that in moments in time, of course, people do atrocious things. And the PKK did engage in terrorist acts, just like the IRA engaged in terrorist acts. Now, you can explain that and you can argument that. But of course, what you can't do is bring back the people who have died because of those terrorist acts, or bring back the people who have died because of the Turkish state terrorism or the Turkish state authoritarian acts either. It was a war, and I think the Belgian courts described it very well, actually, where they said the PKK were not per se a terrorist group. In our modern understanding of terrorism, they said the PKK was a national liberation group.
Some of your colleagues in the Labour Party have suggested that the new politics being advocated by the Kurdish Freedom Movement, so for example, democratic confederalism and gender equality and ecological sustainability as central to any solution, are simply employed to try to get support from Western leftists. So what would you say to your colleagues who have this doubt and have problematic is this?
There are always doubts. And I think many people feel we have seen national liberation movements elsewhere in the world, national liberation movements that took a leftish tinge previously and then became authoritarian or became particularly nasty. And so I suspect many politicians have felt like they backed those causes and then it backfired on them. And we know many countries, you know, kind of from Zimbabwe and Robert Mugabe to you know, kind of a number in Latin America. So I understand why a number of my colleagues would be nervous.
Mr. Öcalan is under isolation last 20 years now, and he is not allowed to meet his basic human rights. So what is Turkish state's aim by isolating Mr. Abdullah Öcalan?
Look, my view is that Mr. Öcalan should not be in isolation, and he should have more regular contact with his lawyers. At the moment, his lawyers very rarely get contact with him, only after a number of hunger strikes and direct action. In the last year, has some very limited access been allowed. That is not acceptable. And it's quite right that the Council of Europe has looked into this, but they need to look further and they need to be stronger. And I understand the difficulties around it. However, I also think we have to understand that this needs to be a negotiated process. Isolation in an island off the mainland, where lawyers and solicitors and human rights defenders are not allowed to see the prisoner, sounds to me like a very bad thing indeed.
How can the Kurdish Freedom Movement deal with the prejudice that's surrounding being labeled as a terrorist organization?
Well, that will always be difficult because it is undeniable that PKK did take part in activities that were aggressive and violent. But the Belgian court case that I mentioned earlier on was very clear that that was part of a liberation struggle and not a terrorist struggle. And they have been struck off a number of times from the terrorist links because of that. Now, every time they get put back on, Turkey's request, you take it to court, they get taken off, and it's a cat and mouse game. So what we must do is demonstrate that, not deny that there are links historically to the PKK, but demonstrate that people are really committed to a new way of working now. That's what I believe Abdullah Öcalan has done in his views around democratic confederalism. This idea that it's not per se about separate states, but it's about making sure that we have decent regional autonomy for all those regions within different states, and they are given the autonomy to cooperate internationally with each other. And what you do is create a new form of understanding of sovereignty and a new form of understanding of cooperation. And that means at the same time we can have Turkey's and Syria's territorial integrity maintained, and we can have cooperation. It is an option. It's not the only option, but it is an option for a solution for the Kurdish question. And it is a peaceful option that allows people to be maintained safety and security within their own lands.
How can the links between Labour Party and HDP can improve? Although many people think of the HDP as a sister party, there has been very little in the way of solidarity. We have few honorable exceptions, such as yourself. Some HDP MPs have expressed dismay at the silence from Europe in relation to the ongoing human rights violations in Turkey and across the region understood as Kurdistan. So what more can be done to improve the situation?
Well, I was very pleased to go and visit the HDP Congress in Ankara earlier on this year. I went with Julie Ward, my colleague, who was an MEP, and I was joined there by the presidency of the PES, and we went and gave a joint statement, and I was there as Shadow Foreign Minister, and I coordinated that with our Shadow Minister for Peace in the Middle East, and he is very keen to continue those links. That doesn't mean the HDP is our only party that we will work with, and we do think there is a role of working with the CHP, which I know has been historically difficult with some of the Kurdish questions. But more and more, the CHP seem willing to work with the HDP. And our role, I believe, as the Labour Party and as the European Socialists, is to encourage that cooperation. Because the only way, I'm afraid, in Turkey, that we will be able to work against Erdogan and his rather authoritarian tendencies is to make sure that there is a united front. We saw that a little bit in Istanbul, where there was a split in the HDP, wasn't there? Some people wanted to support the joint candidate for the opposition and others didn't. But in the end, most supported the joint candidate and they won. That will mean compromise, but both the CHP and the HDP are our sister parties. We must work with both of them. I aim to try and be that bridge for the HDP. Others of my colleagues will be the bridge for the CHP, and we hope to bring them together.
Thank you. Lloyd Russell Moyle, Labour MP, thanks for joining us today. Thanks for supporting our channel.
No, and thank you to all the support that the Kurdish community has given me here in Brighton at the election. And we had an HDP MP came and visited during the election to support me. And I appreciate all the work that you have, that the Kurdish communities have done for us here. So we must work together, because international solidarity will help us overcome.
Thank you.